Good morning, Nananom, Your Excellencies, members of the Diplomatic Corps, Pro-Vice Chancellor of University of Cape Coast, Chair of PANAFEST Foundation, Executive Secretary of PANAFEST Foundation, President of African Heritage Studies Association, Provosts, Deans, lecturers and students, invited guests, ladies and gentlemen, family, I want to thank you for taking the time to join me for this conversation. I am speaking to you on a pre-recorded version of my talk, in part because I know that this has presented a challenge in terms of technology. This entire COVID pandemic has pushed us all to be creative in all sorts of new ways in finding connection and relation with each other. And so this presented me with an opportunity to really reflect on how securing the African family and thinking about the futures of Pan-Africanism really has to do with figuring out how to improvise, how to sit with rupture, with uncertainty, with things that don't go as planned, with what seem like technological failures, but are in fact sometimes just the glitches that provide an opening to imagine new realities. So I also want to salute my good friend, Professor Kwadwo Opoku Agyemang, and his team, the IT team and others, for soldiering through this really challenging time and convening us in the first truly global PANAFEST that we ever wouldn't have wanted to imagine this way. I am excited that these are the circumstances and that these are the challenges, because I think that the Pan-African encounters that have always interested me are those that emerge out of contexts that seem impossible. Of course, the separations of the transatlantic slave trade and of multiple internal displacements are those that make Pan-Africanism always a kind of miraculous weapon, as Aimé Césaire would say, a weapon of our imagination to think through connections across differences. But I've been particularly interested in how music figures in Pan-African connections, how musicians themselves inspire movements and both political and aesthetic, artistic, but also how music gives us an occasion to get together, and what kind of work do we get done when we are listening together, moving to music together, enjoying and making music together. So I want to tell 3 stories today, each one an instance of what would seem like things going slightly awry, but in fact, a lesson and an inspiration for what it might mean to secure an African family that imagines beyond the limits of our own genealogical units. So the first of these is what I would call oh goodness, sorry about that. What I would call the beginning of the imagination of an event that my talk will center on takes place. So the beginning is 1956, on the cusp of independence in the Gold Coast, when Louis Armstrong gets off of an airplane to give his first concert in Africa on the tarmac in Accra. Then I want to tell you what I think of that moment as a prelude of the Soul to Soul concert in Ghana in 1971, which was held during the independence celebrations that year in April, and brought a number of African-American and American musicians to perform in Accra at Black Star Square. And then to close with another moment from that same journey that wasn't exactly part of the concert, but which is memorialized in a poem by your very own Professor Poku Agyeman, and which I think shows us the ways in which across different art forms, and in fact, across various disciplines, we can carry memories, carry stories, and reinvent out of moments of private insight and sometimes even of private pain, things that are beautiful, powerful, last, and with which we can build. So Louis Armstrong first came to Accra in 1956. It was a concert that was not sponsored by the State Department, as future concerts would be in the sort of state jazz ambassadors movement, we could call it, but where the footage was for a newsreel that was lost. And for many years, fans of Armstrong have always lamented that this newsreel was lost, but parts of it have emerged on YouTube. And as we discover that our archives are often not so much lost as dispersed, it becomes possible to put those stories together. And so the very first image that we see is of Armstrong climbing down from the airplane back in the days when we came up and down on a staircase, and the joyous welcome that he finds. And the concert has not yet started. He's not yet there. And yet the wonderful high life musicians following Iti Mensa there on the tarmac are playing for him. And the story goes, he takes out his trumpet and he starts playing right along with them. The jam session cannot wait. And so that's, I think, one of the key ideas I want us to think about, is that it's all in the timing, and it's always the right time if you just pull out your instrument, whatever your voice is, and start playing. So here we'll have just a little sample of that moment with Louis Armstrong. And I'm going to be doing a little bit of back and forth with trying to share my screen. So here we go. And of course, we can tell that this is a reconstruction because, of course, it was the Gold Coast in 1956. But what we don't see there, but is recorded in other sources, is Louis jamming with them on this tune, Sly Mongoose, All For You, and just the beginning of the band that is really that structure of feeling and possibility that allows for folks who share elements of a global Black culture anchored in numerous African aesthetic principles to join in together as if they are family, because these are ideas and ways of imagining that do come from interlinked sources. This idea of the airport as a key space is one that recurs in multiple other moments of large festival encounters. So in 1966, the president then of Senegal, Leopold Senghor, welcomed a festival audience, the World Festival of World Arts, performers from across the globe, to Dakar. And the film that was made by William Greaves of that event featured multiple scenes of arrival and departure on the airport tarmac. And we have that same scene in Soul to Soul, which is the film that was made about the concert in Accra in 1971. This was a concert that was first imagined and proposed by Maya Angelou when she was living in Accra. She spent just about a year there and wrote about her experiences in her book, All God's Children Need Traveling Shoes, in the mid-60s. She had wound up there because her son had broken his leg and needed to recover. She was touring as a dancer at the time. And so instead she found a job, eventually working as a secretary, I believe, at the university, but was part of the vibrant community of African Americans in Accra and the close relationships that she built with Ghanaians there, and proposed this idea, which it took longer than the time that Angelou was here in Accra for it to come to fruition. But here is this germ of an idea that folks hung on to and brought into being that would outlast even the 71 moment, because the film that was made of it was released in 1972. It showed on television in the US and other places, and then was largely forgotten until it was reissued in 2004. And the musicians on it are, an A-list of A-lists. Many of them were at the apex of their careers as soul musicians. There were people like Wilson Pickett and Tina Turner, Ike Turner back then, the Staple Singers, and also jazz musicians. There was Carlos Santana, there was Les McCann and Eddie Harris, and they are the ones who I want to talk about in a moment. But first, just to kind of drive home this idea of the airport as such a striking moment of encounter. It's often the moment of recognition, but also of surprise and uncertainty. Have I seen you before? Are you long lost family or not? But then again, also, how do we get there? I think that one of the ways we know that travel is so important, I think of Haile Selassie's book, Ghana Must Go, and how travel and air travel and the economies of circulating objects become so built into our everyday lives that a particular kind of bag that says, oh, that's somebody who's trading across the borders and living the itinerant life of folks in the diaspora, sending remittances home, sending used clothing or whatever it is that those informal economies oftentimes operate on. That is being in movement, making a way, figuring out itineraries, restructuring those itineraries. And I am reminded of a poem by another great Ghanaian artist, Kofi Anyidoho, artist and professor, scholar, hero, from his collection, Ancestral Logic and Caribbean Blues. This is a poem called Havana Soul. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I do find it striking that wherever one turns, one finds these live connections. And so as I'm reading this, I'm thinking about our comrades in Cuba and the liberation that they are still struggling for, and the complex ways in which race is lived out in Cuba. But here, let me read the end of this poem where he talks about how the colonial routings of air traffic really continue to make it difficult to realize Pan-Africanism in concrete, practical ways. How do we get from here to there? No one flies the Middle Passage no more, and for lack of friends along the way, Cubana air must take me first to Gander of the intemperate north. We know that Anyidoho is telling us Canada. Then south to Madrid of the arid lands, and Air France into Paris, and Swiss Air into Zurich, and on to the Gold Coast by the Ivory Coast, those sometime treasure lands where now we must embrace the orphan life in small measures of foreign aid. and all our journeys must always take us away from the destinations into dislocations until one day, tired at last from endless trailings of lost purpose and lost vision, we mark the only straight route from Ghana to Havana to Guyana, and on and on and on to Savannah in Georgia of the deep, deep, deep South. With Africana Airways, we can re-navigate the Middle Passage, clear the old debris, and freshen the waters with iodine and soul chlorine. And our journey into soul time will be the distance between the eye and the ear. That distance between the eye and the ear. I think of that sometimes in relation to what the position of the audience is when we're watching a concert as well as listening to it and watching new relationships being forged live. What is it that we are remapping in our imaginations? So I want to take us to a moment in the Soul to Soul concert towards the, well, actually, I'm not sure when in the 14-hour lineup it came. It was a very long concert, very special event. But at a certain point, the free jazz, as the name being given to that kind of experimental and creative music was, the free jazz musicians Les McCann and Eddie Harris came to begin their set. And before traveling, Les McCann had said that he wanted to be able to perform and jam with Ghanaian musicians. And he had the opportunity to do so, meeting a incredible percussion player named Amoa Azangeo, who came from the Bolgatanga region, and who was no more familiar to Accra audiences, one would suspect, than McCann and Harris in many ways. And yet they found each other, and the story of that is told in the liner notes to this wonderful boxed version of the recording of the Soul to Soul concert and some of the music from it. But in any case, what I want to talk about is not how they got connected, but what happened when they did. And I'm actually going to share some of this from my book. Now, McCann and Harris as jazz players, in some ways, specialized in the art of recognition, in listening to their ensemble mates closely enough to recognize what chord quality, groove, harmonic language, and even formal innovations they are favoring in order to improvise in a stylistically consistent and convincing manner. But the pleasure of jazz also depends on the audience recognizing the familiar, and thus the innovative departures from that familiar. In the film, we see a Ghanaian audience shifting uncomfortably as the saxophonist Eddie Harris plays unfamiliar avant-garde reed noise after having won the audience over in a funk blues performance just before. As sophisticates of Accra, this audience seems unprepared to see Azangeo, a northern Ghanaian, perform alongside the international guests to such acclaim. The audience reaction shifts when the musicians begin not only collaborating, but also trading fours in that musical structure where we know to expect a call from, and then a response. What the audience hears and recognizes is a conversation producing something entirely new. The musicians on stage, and on another level, the audience members are all engaged in an acoustic exercise in sustained openness to the other, a call and response that requires recognizing not only the moments of unison, but also their dissonances, allowing a compelling performance on stage to connect with listeners who have already sat through several hours of music at that point in the concert. So I want to play this particular moment and let you see the shift that happens when the music really starts to connect. And this up here. Share screen. And this is not intended as a advertisement for my book, but I am very grateful that Oxford University Press, when they published my book, also agreed to host a website that has some clips from some of the content in it. And so this is that moment in the concert. This is Eddie Harris on the saxophone. And we get Gail. Okay, and let me come out of there. So when Harris ends his phrase, Asangeo begins with that dramatic solo riff on a shekere, and the audience instantly comes alive, cheering, applauding as the rhythmic energy builds. He sings a few lines in fra-fra and then begins to mimic the saxophone's timbre by singing halfway between humming and his full voice. In fact, he distorts Harris's musical message in order to recognize it, respond to it, and return it to Harris and the audience in a form made available to the reinterpretive energies of improvisation. As jazz scholar Ingrid Monson would put it, these instrumentalists are saying something, extending rhetorical gestures from the competitive speech acts such as playing the dozens, and these are the yo mama kind of jokes, right? To a new and highly charged musical context. And it is the logic of interaction, the call and response, the give and take, the collaboration among ensemble members that wins over the audience and allows them to make the connection soul to soul. And this collaboration was an important moment for Asangeo's career. He went on after this to join Faisal Khawani's group, Basa Basa, and John Collins, the high life historian and wonderful Ghanaian musicologist, has noted that while the group's name means pandemonium, Basa Basa in Ga, the fusion of the Ewe Agbadza beat with fra-fra music was one of the most exciting features of that group. So clearly Asangeo's experiences improvising with the soul jazz idiom of Harris and McCann continued to inform his interest in working with musicians of diverse idioms. Yeah. So finally, I want to talk about a moment that's not the kind of big scale stadium euphoria that one gets a sense that even in that very experimental performance with the Harris, McCann, and Asangeo, that there was that energy. In this moment, I want to turn to quietness and to uncertainty. And this is looking at Roberta Flack, who was one of the other performers on the Soul to Soul concert originally, she doesn't appear in the re-released version that came out in 2004. And there's no record of why that is the case. She chose to have her footage removed. But some of it is extant. And so I've been really interested in thinking about memory and archives and the ways in which we know and can sort of anchor ourselves in a past. Right? So if an archive is an unstable one or a dynamic one, you might think, what are the kinds of documents that tell us, quote unquote, truth, the things we need to know? And that's where I think we have an opportunity in situations where it seems like the historical record has been left blank or eroded or has not adequately featured voices of the oppressed or forgotten. That as creative people, and again, when I say creative, I don't just mean artists, but as people of imagination, we can think about how to approach those archives in new ways, to approach even the void of those archives in new ways. And in the book, I talk about some folks who are much more attuned to the limitations of that kind of an imagined supplement, let's say, to an archive that's missing. And in particular to the wonderful work of Saidiya Hartman in her book, Lose Your Mother. But what I'm interested in is how oftentimes it's a song, a remembered song that signifies some sort of a connection. And this comes up in a lot of African-American texts. You get it in W.B. Du Bois, who remembers hearing his great-grandmother singing in an African language when he was a child. You get it in Hartman, where she writes about the pain of coming to West Africa, and particularly spending time on a research project in Ghana, and expecting to have one encounter with the architectures and histories and memories of slavery, and having quite a different one, and discovering that that's not the point of entry for many of the Ghanaians that she meets. Their point of entry is, here's the person right here in front of me, let's have a conversation, rather than really trying to do the kind of historical and emotional reckoning that she's come seeking. But even for her, she writes about a song that she hears when she's in Gwolu, and wanting to, or being moved to recognize in that song the memory of how one would be safe within the walls of a city of refuge. In any case, let's get to Roberta. And one of the really moving moments in the original film is when she goes with Les McCann to visit the slave dungeons at Cape Coast Castle. The sequence begins with telescoping shots of the architectural details of the castle, evoking for the viewer the experience of being overwhelmed by the space itself. And this is from the original version of the film. It's available as a VHS, a couple of libraries here and there, but I'm sure it will trickle out on YouTube as that archive kind of deauthorizes the power of official archives. But in any case, the sequence begins with telescoping shots of the architectural details of the castle, evoking for the viewer the experience of being overwhelmed by the space itself. As the two enter the courtyard, Flack makes a comment whose simplicity verges on the banal, but the lowered tone and pitch of her voice indicate the gravity of their encounter with history. This is a very depressing place, and it's oppressive, and just all sorts of unhappy, sorrowful things. Clearly, speech is insufficient to express the excessive affective, emotional charge of this place. I think that it's the very plainness of her speech that's a truer and maybe the only possible representation of the impossibility of reading and interpreting trauma, the trauma of that place. As McCann and Flack walk into the dungeon, the screen darkens to almost complete blackness, except for a window, which, shot facing the sun, glows in preternatural blue. And unseen, Flack is moved to sing the spiritual, "Oh freedom, oh freedom, oh freedom." And the film captures her voice singing off screen. And before I'll be a slave, and before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave. Figuring those resonances in the space while we can't see Flack's own body. So there's two layers of this erasure of her own body being erased in the darkness, and as well as saying, in a way, that claiming that rather than slavery is its own freedom. The crucial question here is whether this singing constitutes a performance. The very concept of performance presupposes an audience, a dimension of spectacle and display. But in that moment, she really went inwards. And there's an almost poetic justice in the fact that it is a scene that's erased from the film itself, because it asks us to grant her the privacy of that moment of reckoning with the deep historical and personal implications of that historical hurt, but then also recognizing that as part of her work as an artist that enables and maybe even requires her to do the other kinds of performing work that she does. So I want to take a moment to watch what was her public performance, and to notice that just as the moment that's captured in the video requires a certain kind of respect for us, that from us, a kind of withdrawing our curiosity to see what happened there. So in this performance, she's a singer, songwriter, playing the piano and singing alone, right? So just the visuals of that alone look quite different. And they invite us, I think, to recognize that we can all be on, we can all be performers some of the time, but we can only do that if we have time to not be on, time to be doing our work. So let's get, and by that I mean emotional work. Let's go here and I thought I had the clip here. Let me see. I'm going to take a pause for a moment. Okay, I found the clip that I was looking for, and it reminded me. I've also wanted to note that this footage that's from the original video as well is available to us now because somebody put it on YouTube from the video, and I promise it wasn't me from that original one. But that's just to say, on the one hand, we have all these concerns about copyright protection, etc. But there is a way in which certain things would come available, but also that's still an editing process, that a concert performance looks like worth recording, a private encounter sometimes looks like rehearsal and maybe not attended to as much. And it's the combination of the two. And in these kinds of live visits where you're seeing people eating together and walking down the street and staring at each other, etc., those are the moments where we get the real human connections that add another dimension to artistic performance. Here we go.
Ladies and gentlemen, prepare to fly. I try to reason. I tell myself you'll return, but you are gone. And I know you're gone. You were mine only the minute. If I hurt you, I didn't intend it. You are gone away. I keep telling my mind, you're not gonna stay. And I believe sometimes I've lost you, baby. You are gone.
Okay, always painful to have to stop the music, but there it is. I think it's, uh, a telling choice to that piece that lingers in this moment of you are gone, right? So on the one hand, of a romantic rupture, but also of acknowledging a rupture within the African diasporic world of these absences, right? And that it's not a simple thing that those somehow cohere automatically into a family, and if so, what kind of family? Well, I want to close with a reading of a poem by Professor Opoku Ajimon, which recalls that moment in the slave dungeon that is otherwise lost to us in terms of access to an archive. And I'll read the whole thing and let it speak for itself. An air for Roberta, who sang Crying in the Dungeons from Cape Coast Castle. I pitch my ambition no higher than recitation. My voice, go below and slow, pay your way as you go. Let us reconstruct the footprints of the voices that last attempted breakout from the dungeon wall. Here, two braves slipped and fell, wailing, buried the silence and the centuries. Here, Anokie planted his sword of war, then unarmed, and his innocence still whole, went to chase down death. Over there in Crook, the chains bared their teeth, then clamped them to over a reckless helm. Let us go with the waves that never miss an appointment. My voice, or be low and slow, or be high like a bartizan. We have miles and miles to go to find there is no anger safe in the land. The castle is sound, invisible in its whiteness. I pitch recall, no higher than recital, the ruthless devouring, no louder than the coughing footsteps and the sound of seed going to seed. I rest my ambition, my voice, a simple air, my tune of choice. I've read that poem a number of times, and as I was looking at it in preparation for this presentation, I realized that it's the simplicity there that seems most telling. This choice to rest one's voice and not to go for the ambition and for the large and the loud and the brash and the proud. That's so easy in so many ways, but to go inward and to the minimal that it takes to be really in relation to each other and to recognize family everywhere it appears. And I thought about this, family can be those big, loud events, but it doesn't have to be the matching t-shirts of a family reunion photo shot, or the feast to which even your neighbors whose names you don't fully recall are invited and made to see the plenty of. it doesn't need to be on what we call the good china. Family are the people we can be ourselves around, the people we drop pretensions with, the people we can throw a meal together with out of leftovers, or as I like to call them, encores, right? The people we can just hang out with without our guard up. Just like when we don't know a tune until we sing it, we don't know what an encore tastes like, a leftover, until we cook it together. And so that's what I want to leave us with, is this idea that in the arts we've seen, people make a whole lot of something out of a mere nothing, it seems, and out of a chance encounter. Asangeo was not planning to be part of the Soul to Soul concert, and when he and McCann encountered each other, the creative energy was just electric. Or the notion of a Louis Armstrong not to be just the big guy riding around in his seat there on the shoulders of others, but to climb on down and play the trumpet with them. Elsewhere, we've got him giving a concert and having, you can see him dancing with the other people there. But this sense that it's in the back rooms, in the places below, but also in those spots that we don't think of as making history, that we live history and we live it together. So I thank you so much for your attention and your time and your patience. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of this PANAFEST week. Thanks.